Settle in, pull the blanket a little closer, let the day fold itself away and rest for a while on a soft and gentle question, the kind of question that seems small at first, almost trivial, almost too quiet to matter, and which turns out, the longer one looks at it, to open onto one of the strangest mysteries in the whole long story of what it means to be human. Imagine, for a moment, that you are sitting somewhere warm and softly lit, the air still, the room hushed, and that across from you, very close, sits another person whom you know well, whom you trust, whose face has been part of the small library of faces that you carry with you everywhere you go. The light is low, the hour is late. There is no particular reason to speak, and so neither of you speaks, and a small silence settles between you like a feather coming to rest on still water. And in this silence, almost without intending to, you find yourself looking into the other person's eyes, and the other person, almost without intending to, is looking into yours, and for a long uncertain moment neither of you looks away. What is it exactly that you're seeing in those eyes? You're seeing the dark round pupil at the centre, that small black doorway through which all the light of the world enters the brain. You're seeing the coloured ring of the iris around it, brown perhaps, or hazel, or blue, or some quiet shade in between. And you are seeing, surrounding all of that, a wide, soft, snow-pale field, the bright, gentle whites of the eye, framing the coloured centre like the page of an open book frames a single drop of ink. And in those whites, you're seeing something you almost never think about, something so familiar that it has become invisible, and yet something so strange, so unique, so mysterious in the long history of life on this planet that, once you notice it, you may never quite be able to unsee it. You are seeing a trait that no other species on Earth has, in quite the way that humans have it. You are seeing a part of the body that is on display every moment of every day, in every encounter with every other person, and which, despite its constant presence, is so anatomically peculiar that scientists have spent decades arguing about why it exists at all. You're seeing the visible whites of the eye, the bright clear sclera, the soft pale window that frames the human gaze, and you are seeing it in a creature, your beloved across from you, who happens to belong to the only species in the world that wears this trait so openly, so universally, so unmistakably on the front of its face. Drift now, just for a moment, away from this firelit room and into the dim green canopy of a faraway forest, where a chimpanzee sits on a low branch in the late afternoon, its dark fur catching only the soft scattered coins of light that filter through the leaves. Look at the chimpanzee's eyes. Try to find, in those eyes, the same bright pale field that you just saw in the eyes of your beloved. You will not find it. The chimpanzee's eyes are dark all the way across, the iris merging seamlessly into a deeply pigmented sclera, the whole eyeball reading as a single unbroken sphere of brown and black. The chimpanzee, our nearest living cousin, the creature with whom we share more than 98% of our DNA, does not have the bright whites that we have. Neither does the gorilla, nor the orangutan, nor the bonobo, nor any of the other great apes that share our deep family tree. Neither does the wolf, nor the lion, nor the eagle, nor any of the great predators that prowled the same long evening in which our species first stood upright. None of them, not really, not in the way that we do. Only humans wear, on the front of every single face, this bright pale flag of attention, this glowing window onto where we are looking and what we're doing. And the question, the soft and patient question that this long quiet evening will turn over slowly in its hands, is the simplest question in the world. Why? Why us? Why only us? What is the white of the human eye for, and what in the long slow making of our species made us into the only creatures on Earth who carry it? Settle deeper. The question is older than civilization. The answer reaches back through millions of years, through forests and savannas and ice age caves, through the small hands of the first toolmakers and the careful gaze of the first mothers, through the silent coordinated hunts of hominins long since vanished from the world, through the very moments when our species began, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to become itself. And tonight, with no rush at all, with all the time in the world, with the room warm and the breath slow and the candle low, this gentle story will unfold paragraph by paragraph, like a long soft road stretching into the quiet hills of a land you have never seen, and which, by the time the road has run its full course, you will know in some private corner of yourself the way one knows a face that has been seen too long to be forgotten. Close your eyes if you wish, or keep them open. The story will go where you let it go. And the white of the human eye, that small impossible feature you carry in your own face right now, that you have carried with you every day of your life, will turn out to be a door, a window, a quiet, luminous threshold across which an entire species walked, a long, long time ago, and through which, in some wordless way, the deepest things about who you are and who you have always been can be very gently traced. For most of human history, no one thought to ask this question at all. The white of the eye was simply something that was, the way the moon is something that is, the way water is wet and grass is green and bones are hard. It was a feature of the world so ordinary, so universal, so unremarked upon, that it slipped beneath the notice of everyone who carried it. Children grew up looking into their mother's eyes without ever wondering why those whites were so bright. Hunters tracked one another across fields and forests with silent coordinated glances without ever pausing to consider that the silent coordinated glance was only possible because of the visible whites of every eye involved. Whole civilizations rose and fell, whole languages flourished and faded, whole continents were crossed by foot and by boat and by dream, and through all of that vast tapestry of human living, almost no one ever stopped to ask why the human face was painted in this one quiet way, so utterly unlike every other face in the natural world. It was not until the careful, patient gaze of comparative anatomy turned itself, in the last few centuries, toward the eyes of the great apes, that the strangeness of the human eye began to come into focus. Naturalists who had studied chimpanzees and gorillas in the field began to notice, with a small sense of surprise, that those eyes did not look like human eyes, not because of size or shape or placement, but because of something subtler, something in the surrounding tissue, something in the way the dark iris seemed to dissolve into the surrounding sphere rather than stand out against a bright pale frame. The more they looked, the more puzzling the difference became. Here were two species, the human and the chimpanzee, separated by perhaps 7 million years of independent evolution, sharing nearly everything else: the same hands, the same teeth, the same lungs, the same blood, the same long and intricate brains. And yet at the level of the eye, that small 2-centimetre sphere through which both species saw the world, the configuration was profoundly different. The chimpanzee carried the dark sclera that virtually every other primate carried, the inheritance of a lineage tens of millions of years old, a configuration that worked beautifully, a configuration that hid the gaze and protected the privacy of attention. And the human carried something else, something new, something that broadcast the gaze rather than concealing it, something that turned the eye into a soft transmitter rather than a quiet receiver. This difference, once noticed, demanded to be explained. And the explaining, when scientists set themselves to it, opened onto a much larger question. A question about what kind of creature the human had become, what kind of social life the human had built, what kind of pressures the human had answered in becoming itself. Because in evolutionary biology, no trait is ever truly small. No feature of the body is ever simply decorative. Every visible part of every animal is the result of millions of years of slow patient pressure, the accumulated weight of countless small selections, the long quiet sieving of who survived to leave children and who did not. A trait that becomes universal in a species, a trait that no member of that species lacks, a trait that has been shaped to such a precise and recognizable form, must have been doing some kind of work, some kind of slow, important work, across the deep time of the species becoming. And the bright white sclera of the human eye, by every measure, is exactly such a trait. It is universal. It is precise. It is recognizable across all human populations, in every climate and every continent, in every age of recorded history and presumably in every age before recorded history as well. It is, in a word, deeply meaningful, even though no one ever taught us to read it, even though no human ever asked their child to please notice the whites. The stakes of the question, once one begins to feel them, are larger than they first appear. Because if the white of the eye is doing something important, if it has been shaped by some specific evolutionary pressure across the long becoming of our species, then the trait is not merely interesting in its own right. It is a small, bright window onto the very forces that made us human in the first place. To understand why the eyes are white is to understand something about the kind of life our ancestors were living when this trait emerged, the kind of social world they were navigating, the kind of communication they had begun to need. The white sclera, in this sense, is a fossil of behaviour, a frozen biological record of what early humans must have been doing with one another to make this strange visible feature worth carrying. And what they were doing, the answers will gently suggest, may turn out to be the most important thing any species has ever done. They were learning to coordinate. They were learning to share attention. They were learning to read one another's minds across the small, soft distances of a campfire or a hunting party or a mother's loving lap. And the bright white frame of the eye was both the medium and the messenger of this slow, strange revolution, the small visible signal that allowed an unprecedented kind of cooperation to take root in the long savanna afternoons of our deep ancestry. To say this is not to overstate the matter. Many of the traits that we hold dear about our species, language and art and ritual and teaching and shared work, depend, in some deep underlying way, on the ability of humans to coordinate their attention with one another, to know what another person is looking at, to share a focus that exists only in the meeting of two pairs of eyes. Without that capacity, without the silent threadwork of shared gaze that runs constantly through every human interaction, none of those higher achievements would have been possible. We would have been clever solitary creatures, perhaps, or noisy obvious group animals communicating through grunts and gestures and the heavy choreography of full body movement. But we would not have been the soft, fluent cooperators that we became, the species that can build a city by passing intentions silently between thousands of pairs of eyes, the species that can teach a child to read by gazing together at a single page, the species that can sit in two chairs late at night and feel that something has been understood without a single word having been spoken. If this reading is correct, if the white of the eye really is the small biological infrastructure on which so much of our shared humanity rests, then the question of why we have it becomes one of the most consequential questions in the whole study of human origins. It is not just a curiosity for primatologists. It is, in some real sense, the question of how we came to be the kind of creature that builds civilizations, the question of how cooperation found a body to grow in, the question of how the inner world of one mind first learned to leak out, gently and visibly, into the inner world of another mind across the small bright distance between two faces, and so the slow, gentle inquiry that lies ahead, the long unfolding examination of the white of the human eye, is not merely an inquiry into anatomy. It is an inquiry into the very fabric of human social life, into the conditions that made our species possible, into the silent pressures that shaped us into a creature whose very face was rebuilt, ever so slightly, to allow for a kind of looking together that no other animal had ever needed in quite this way. Of course, the rebuilding was not free. It cost something. Every evolutionary change carries a price, and the bright white sclera carried prices of its own, prices that have to be reckoned with before the story can move on. To make the eye visible was to give up a great deal of what every other primate enjoyed: the privacy of the gaze, the discretion of the dark sclera, the ability to attend without being read. Early humans, in evolving this trait, were trading away a kind of biological camouflage that had served their ancestors for tens of millions of years. They were stepping out of the protective shadow of the dark eye and into a kind of permanent visibility, a permanent vulnerability, a permanent willingness to broadcast where their attention was going at every moment to anyone who happened to be watching. Predators could read it. Prey could read it. Other humans, of course, could read it most of all, but the cost was that everyone could read it, friend and foe alike. And for this trait to have spread across the whole of the species, for it to have replaced the dark sclera so thoroughly that every human born today carries the bright pale version, the benefits must have outweighed those costs by a substantial margin. Whatever the white of the eye was buying, it was buying enough to compensate for the surrender of biological privacy, enough to compensate for the increased visibility to the long line of predators that walked alongside us through the deep savannas, enough to make the trade clearly worth making, generation after generation, across hundreds of thousands of years. What could possibly be worth that trade? What could possibly justify the surrender of one of the most ancient and useful adaptations in the primate toolkit? The answer, when it begins to come into view, will turn out to involve some of the most beautiful and tender capacities of our species: the capacity to teach a child without words, the capacity to hunt as a single, coordinated organism made of many smaller bodies, the capacity to look at another human across the small space of a shared room and feel that one's inner attention has been seen, has been answered, has been accompanied, even in the absence of speech. These capacities, taken together, may have been so transformative for our ancestors, so powerful in the slow project of survival, that they tipped the long evolutionary balance toward the bright white eye. And once tipped, the balance never tipped back. The trait spread, fixed, deepened, until every human anywhere carried it, until no human could be born without it, until the bright white sclera became as inevitable a feature of the human face as the lips or the brow or the nose, as if the species had quietly decided, somewhere deep in its becoming, that the visibility of the gaze was simply non-negotiable. But to feel the full weight of why this trait spread, why it triumphed despite its costs, one has to understand, slowly and carefully, exactly what the trait actually is, anatomically speaking, and exactly how it differs from the eyes of every other creature on Earth. One has to understand the chemistry of the sclera, the role of melanin in the surrounding tissues, the precise comparison between the human eye and the eyes of the chimpanzee, and the gorilla, and the bonobo, and the orangutan, and all the other animals whose eyes have been carefully studied. One has to understand what the fossil record can and cannot tell us about when this trait first emerged in the long human lineage, how recent or how ancient it might be, what hominins along the way might have carried it. And one has to understand, perhaps most importantly, the cost side of the equation, the predatory danger that comes with such a visible signal, the way that bright eyes glinting in the savanna grass would have given away the position and the attention of every prehistoric human who carried them. Only by understanding all of this, slowly and gently and in careful order, can the answers begin to land with their full weight. Only by understanding the trait can the explanations for the trait take their proper shape. So this is where the long road must begin. Not with the explanations, not with the cooperative eye hypothesis or the mate selection theories or any of the other beautiful arguments that scientists have offered. The road must begin, as all good roads do, with the territory itself, with the small physical reality of the human sclera, with the comparison across species, with the careful map of what is universal and what is unique. From there, with the trait understood, with its costs reckoned, with its strangeness fully appreciated, the larger questions can come into view, and the soft, slow tour of why we are the bright-eyed creature we are can finally begin in earnest. The road is long, but the night is long too, and there is no rush. The whites of every human eye on Earth have been patiently waiting to tell their story for 2 million years. They can wait a little longer, while the foundation is laid, and so the question settles upon us like a soft fog gathering at the base of an ancient tree, drifting between the roots and the moss, asking quietly what it is about the human eye that should matter so much, and the answer begins not with philosophy or with grand sweeping theories of the mind, but with something far simpler and far stranger, something you could hold in the palm of your hand if you could only reach behind the curtain of the body and lift it free, and that something is the sclera, the white of the eye, the outer wall, the curved shell that holds everything else in place. The sclera is not a delicate thing, despite the softness of its appearance, despite the way it seems to shine with a kind of liquid gentleness when caught in candlelight or in the slanting amber of a late afternoon sun. The sclera is in fact a dense and fibrous structure, a tough wall of collagen woven in interlocking bundles, layered upon itself in sheets and lattices and crisscrossing strands, providing the eyeball with its shape, its rigidity, its quiet structural courage. Without the sclera, the eye would collapse like a deflated fruit, would lose its perfect spherical curvature, would surrender its ability to hold the precious lens and retina in their exact and necessary places. The sclera is the unsung architecture of vision, the silent scaffolding upon which every glance and every gaze is built, and it makes up nearly the entire outer surface of the eyeball, wrapping around it like a soft, pale stocking, broken only at the front where it meets the transparent dome of the cornea, that clear window through which light enters to begin its long and intricate journey. Now imagine, drifting closer, the texture of this collagen wall, the way the fibres run in all directions like the threads of an old woven blanket, intersecting and overlapping, lending strength through their disorder, providing the eye with a wall that can resist pressure from within and gentle bumps from without. Beneath this fibrous outer layer, the sclera contains very little pigment in most human eyes, almost none at all in the surface tissue that catches the light. There is no melanin in this superficial layer, none of the dark biological dye that colours skin and hair and irises, none of the protective shading that paints the eyes of most other creatures. The collagen itself is a translucent material, milky and pale, scattering light in all directions when it strikes the surface. And this scattering of light is precisely what produces the appearance of whiteness, the soft glow that gives the human eye its distinctive look. Underneath this outer layer there are deeper tissues, the choroid and other vascular structures, sometimes faintly visible in certain individuals as a soft bluish tint in babies or a gentle yellowish hue in older adults. But for the most part the surface layer dominates, and the surface layer is bright and pale and unmistakably white, like fresh snow on a hillside, like a smooth river stone polished by 1,000 years of slow water. Now drift gently, away from the human face and into a different scene altogether, into a canopy of green leaves so thick the sunlight only filters through in scattered coins of gold, into the heart of a tropical forest where the air hangs heavy and damp, and the soft sound of distant rain beats softly against the broad fronds overhead. Here, in this dim cathedral of green, sits a chimpanzee, perched on a branch with its long arms folded, its dark fur catching only the faintest light, its face turned slightly toward you, with an expression that is intelligent and watchful, and infinitely difficult to read. Look closely at the chimpanzee's eyes, and the first thing that strikes you is how dark they are, how solid, how singular. There is no flash of white at the corners, no contrast between the iris and the surrounding sphere, no bright field of pale tissue against which the dark pupil floats. Instead, the entire eye, from edge to edge, appears to be one continuous orb of deep brown and black, the iris merging seamlessly with the sclera itself heavily pigmented, suffused with melanin in such concentration that it nearly matches the colour of the dark face around it. The chimpanzee's eye is a single dark moon, a polished sphere of obsidian set into the dark fur of the face, and looking at it directly, you find it remarkably difficult to tell exactly where the chimpanzee is looking, whether it is gazing at you, at a leaf above your head, at a fruit in the corner of its vision, at nothing in particular at all. The direction of the gaze is hidden, masked, blended into the general dark roundness of the eye, and the chimpanzee thus carries with it everywhere a kind of natural privacy, a quiet curtain drawn across the small theatre of its attention. Drift now to the gorilla, that great and gentle giant who sits in the shadowed clearings of the Central African forests, and the same pattern repeats itself, almost identically. The gorilla's eyes are deep, dark wells set into a face of soft black skin, the sclera pigmented to such a degree that it is virtually indistinguishable from the iris, the whole eyeball reading as one uniform pool of darkness. A silverback gorilla can stare directly at a small bird flitting through the undergrowth, and an observer standing only a few feet away might find it nearly impossible to follow the gorilla's gaze, might find it difficult even to determine whether the gorilla is staring or merely resting its eyes in the general direction of the foliage. The orangutan, swinging slowly through the upper branches of the Bornean rainforest, with its long and meditative limbs and its philosophical brow, presents the same mystery. Its eyes are dark, deeply pigmented, the sclera tinted with melanin to the point of disappearance, and gazing into the orangutan's face one feels oneself in the presence of a creature whose attention is everywhere and nowhere, whose looking is concealed beneath a velvet cloak of biological tinting. The bonobo, that gentle cousin of the chimpanzee, follows the same rule, although in some bonobos the sclera shows a faint trace of lighter colour at the very edges, a hint of the variation that exists in the ape lineage, but still the dominant impression is of a dark and uniform sphere, an eye that holds its secrets close. Across the entire family of great apes, then, this is the standard pattern, the inherited norm, the ancient configuration that has served the primate lineage for tens of millions of years, the heavily pigmented sclera that blends into the iris and renders the direction of gaze obscure to outside observers, and it is a beautiful and elegant adaptation in its own right, this dark, continuous eye, a perfect economy of melanin and tissue and biological discretion, allowing each animal to look without being read, to attend without being interrogated, to navigate a complex social world without giving away the small, constant flickerings of its attention to every nearby creature. Now leave the forests of the apes, and let the mind drift across the broader animal kingdom, into the hunting grounds of the predators, into the dim of a high rocky ledge where a hawk perches with its golden eye fixed on the valley below. The hawk's eye is enormous in proportion to its head, almost grotesquely large, but the visible portion of that eye is dominated by the iris, a deep golden ring around a coal-black pupil, and the sclera is largely hidden, tucked away within the eye socket, set so deep that only a thin rim of it shows, even when the bird turns its head sharply. The owl, perched silently on a moonlit branch in a forest of pines, has eyes so vast that they fill the entire front of its face. But again the iris dominates, the sclera concealed by deep socketing and by the surrounding ring of feathers that frames the gaze. The cat, prowling through tall grass in the cool of evening, presents the same configuration. A great central iris, vertical pupils slitting open and closed with the available light, and a sclera that barely shows, sometimes faintly visible at the corners as a thin sliver of pale tissue, but largely tucked behind the surrounding lids and rim. The wolf and the bear, the lion in the savannah, the leopard high in the branches of a baobab tree, all of these powerful predatory animals carry eyes whose surrounding sclera is either dark or hidden, or both. Eyes designed to lock onto prey without telegraphing the lock. Eyes that allow the hunter to see without being seen seeing. The pattern shifts a little among the prey animals, those creatures whose survival depends on watchfulness and on the rapid communication of alarm. The deer in the meadow, lifting its head from the dewy grass at the snap of a distant twig, may show a flash of white at the edge of its eye when it rolls its gaze sharply to one side, the sclera briefly visible as the eye turns, a flicker of pale tissue that signals fear and alertness to the rest of the herd. The horse, nervous and listening, may show the whites of its eyes when startled, the rim of pale sclera appearing as the eye widens and the body tenses for flight. The goat, picking its way along a steep mountain path, may glance backward with a brief glimpse of sclera showing at the corner of the eye. But in all of these animals, the white of the eye is occasional, situational, a momentary flash rather than a constant feature, a sign of distress or arousal rather than the resting baseline of the visible face. In their calm and unstartled state, the eyes of these animals are dominated by the iris, the sclera tucked away or only faintly present, the gaze again largely obscured to outside observers. Even among the dogs, those long companions of the human household, the picture is varied and complicated. Some breeds, particularly those bred for human-like communication, show more sclera than their wolf ancestors did, a small evolutionary echo of the human pattern. But the showing is partial, intermittent, breed-dependent, never universal across the species. A husky might glance sideways and reveal a brief crescent of white. A Pekingese might show more sclera than a German shepherd. But in the wild ancestors of the dog, in the grey wolves of the northern forests, the sclera is once again largely hidden. The eye predominantly iris and pupil, the gaze quietly directed without external commentary. Across the entire vast and varied kingdom of vertebrate life, then, in mammals and birds and reptiles and fish, the visible bright white sclera as a standard, ever-present resting trait is essentially absent. Some species show occasional flashes of pale sclera under stress, some show small slivers of it at the corners of the eye, some have lighter rims visible only in certain moods or postures, but none, except for the human, has built a face around the constant, unmistakable presence of a great pale field of sclera surrounding a darker iris. None has made of the eye such a vivid and high-contrast canvas. None has chosen to render the small, dark moving point of the pupil so easy to track from across a clearing, across a campfire, across the soft breadth of a shared room. The chemistry of the human sclera, considered closely, is the chemistry of an absence rather than a presence. There is no melanin in the surface layer of the human sclera in most populations, no protective dye laid down to shield the underlying tissues from light or from observation. The collagen itself is the dominant material, and the collagen is translucent, milky, scattering light into the soft white that defines the human eye. In some populations there are faint underlying tints, the bluish hue of thinner sclera in infants where the deeper choroid layer shows through more clearly, the gentle yellowish cast that develops in certain older adults as fatty deposits accumulate in the surface tissue, the light tan coloration that some individuals display naturally. But the dominant feature, the universal feature, the trait that defines the human eye across every continent and every population and every era of recorded history, is the bright, clear pale sclera, the soft snow-white wall against which the iris floats like a pebble at the bottom of a clear stream. And this whiteness is not merely the absence of pigment, not merely the failure to deposit melanin in the right tissue layer, but the result of a specific evolutionary path, a deliberate biological investment, a turning away from the dark sclera of the ancestral primate face and towards something new, something exposed, something almost reckless. Drift now to a different scene, a dim cave somewhere in the limestone hills of Europe, lit only by the soft yellow flicker of a researcher's lantern, and on a stone shelf there rests an ancient skull, the cranium of a hominin who walked the cold earth tens or hundreds of thousands of years ago, and this skull holds within its bony architecture the eye sockets of the long-vanished individual, the orbital cavities where the eyes once sat. The bone tells the researcher many things: the size of the eye, the angle of its placement, the depth of the socket, the shape of the surrounding ridges, but the bone does not preserve the soft tissues of the sclera, does not record whether the eye was light or dark in its surrounding fields, does not tell us directly whether the long-vanished individual stared out at the world with bright pale whites or with dark uniform spheres like a chimpanzee's. The fossil record is silent on this question in the most direct sense, offering only indirect clues, the ratios of orbit dimensions, comparisons of socket shape with modern apes and modern humans, the careful measurements of the bony rim that once held the eye in place. From these indirect clues, scholars have constructed careful arguments. The orbital dimensions of the Neanderthal, that close cousin of modern humans who walk the cold landscapes of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, suggest large eyes, slightly larger than the eyes of modern humans on average, eyes adapted perhaps to the dimmer light of high northern latitudes during the Ice Ages. Whether these large Neanderthal eyes also had bright white sclera is a matter of ongoing and unresolved debate, with some scholars arguing yes, that the white sclera trait must have emerged in the common ancestor of modern humans and Neanderthals, perhaps several 100,000 years ago, and with other scholars arguing that the trait is more recent, that it emerged within the lineage of modern humans alone, perhaps within the last 100,000 or 200,000 years. The genetic evidence is incomplete, and the soft tissue evidence is absent, and so the question floats in a kind of scholarly twilight, half known and half mysterious, with reasonable arguments on either side and no fossil that can settle the matter directly. What can be said with reasonable confidence, drawing the threads together, is that the bright white sclera trait emerged sometime within the last 1 or 2 million years of human evolution, sometime after the split between the human lineage and the lineage of the chimpanzee, sometime during the long, strange journey of bipedalism and tool use, and growing brains and changing diets and lengthening childhoods, sometime during that great transformation that turned a small, dark-faced primate into the bright-eyed creature we know today. The trait did not appear all at once in all likelihood, but spread gradually through populations, perhaps with intermediate forms showing partial pigmentation, perhaps with regional variations that have since been smoothed away by the genetic mixing of countless generations. By the time anatomically modern humans appeared, the trait was either present or rapidly becoming so, and within a relatively short evolutionary span it had become universal, fixed, the standard configuration of the human face. Now consider in the soft floating contemplation of this slow tour the enormous biological cost that this trait must have carried. Imagine a small group of early humans walking through a tall grass savanna at dusk, the sun low on the horizon, the long shadows stretching across the dry earth, and somewhere in the distance a predator watches, a leopard perhaps, or one of the great cats that no longer roam the modern world but once shadowed every step of human ancestry. The predator's eye, dark and hidden, scans the moving figures and tries to identify, among the swaying grasses and the play of light, exactly where each human is looking, exactly which direction each face is turned, exactly when an opportunity might present itself. And here, glinting in the fading light, are the bright pale spheres of human eyes, broadcasting their direction of attention with a clarity that no other primate offers, telling the predator at a distance whether the prey is alert, whether the prey is looking away, whether the prey is engaged in some other distracting task. The white sclera is, from a predator's point of view, a gift, a beacon, an advertisement of inattention or of focus, a visible signal that ought to make the early human dramatically easier to stalk, to ambush, to bring down in the long hunt of survival. By every cold logic of natural selection, this trait should have been ruthlessly culled from the population, should have been selected against generation after generation, should have rendered its bearers measurably more vulnerable to the constant pressure of predation that shaped every other aspect of early human anatomy, The runners survived, the climbers survived, the throwers and the toolmakers and the firemakers survived, but anything that made them easier to spot, easier to read, easier to ambush, ought by all the rules of evolutionary biology to have been pruned away into invisibility. And yet here it is, the bright white sclera, alive and well and universal, painting the face of every human child born today and every human child born for as far back as the genetic and fossil records can reach. The trait did not merely survive in spite of its cost, it flourished, it spread, it became fixed in the species, and this can only mean one thing, that whatever advantages it conferred must have been so enormous, so decisive, so transformative, that they outweighed even the constant predatory danger of being more visible to the watching eyes of leopards and lions and wolves and bears, and the countless other hunters that shared the early human world. Drift now to a fireside, in some imagined night somewhere in the long darkness of prehistory, a small gathering of humans seated around a low orange flame, the smoke curling up into the cool evening air, the faces of the gathered figures lit softly by the flickering light. Look at the eyes, in this firelight, and observe how vividly they shine, how clearly the dark pupils stand out against the pale fields of sclera, how each glance, each shift of attention, each small flickering movement of the gaze can be read by every other person around the fire. One human looks up at the stars, and every other human can see that this person is looking up. Another human looks at the small child sleeping against the warmth of an adult's arm, and every other human can see the direction of that loving glance. A third human looks toward the dark edge of the firelight, where the shadows begin and the unknown waits, and every other human can immediately follow that gaze and look in the same direction, can immediately understand that something there has caught the attention, something there might be worth watching, something there might be worth knowing about. The eye in this scene is not merely a receiver of light, not merely a tool for the individual seeing of the world. The eye has become a transmitter, a broadcaster, a soft visible signal that connects each member of the group to every other, that makes the inner attention of the mind into something that can be shared, that can be read, that can be answered, and every other primate drifting back to that thought hides this very signal. The chimpanzee in its dark forest, the gorilla in its shadowed clearing, the orangutan in its high canopy, the bonobo in its riverside grove, all of them carry eyes that conceal where they are looking, eyes that protect the privacy of their gaze, eyes that allow them to attend without telegraphing their attention. The whole great family of apes, with whom humans share so much of their biology and so much of their evolutionary history, has built itself around the principle of the hidden gaze, the dark uniform sphere, the eye that gives nothing away. And yet humans, alone among them, have made the opposite choice, have built their faces around the broadcasting of attention rather than its concealment, have stripped the melanin from the surface of the sclera and turned the eye into a signal that can be read across a clearing, across a campfire, across the soft length of a shared room. Every other primate hides where they are looking, humans broadcast it. And the question, lying gently at the heart of all this slow contemplation, is why? Why this strange trade-off? Why this surrendering of evolutionary discretion? Why this willingness to carry on the front of every face the bright pale flag of attention, visible to predators, visible to prey, visible to anyone with eyes to see? There must be something, the slow reasoning whispers, something in the way the human creature came to live with other human creatures, something in the new and unfamiliar shape of human social life that turned what should have been a fatal vulnerability into the most precious of biological gifts, something that needed exactly this signal in exactly this form, something that depended upon the small, constant, visible flickering of where each person was looking and what they were looking at, and what their attention was doing moment by moment, glance by glance, around the fires and across the long, slow nights of the deepening human story. And so, with the soft anatomy of the bright white sclera now resting gently in the mind, the curtain of curiosity draws back upon a deeper question. The question of why such a feature should ever have come to be, why nature, so famously frugal with her gifts, should have polished a small ring of tissue into something so visible, so unmistakable, so unlike the eyes of every cousin species that walks the forests and the plains, and the answer that has gathered the most quiet conviction among those who study the deep history of the human mind is an answer rooted not in vanity, not in disease, not in some random drift of biology, but in the slow and patient miracle of cooperation itself, the strange and singular human gift of working together, of pulling on the same invisible rope, of building and hunting and gathering and dreaming as one creature made of many. The hypothesis carries a fittingly gentle name, the cooperative eye hypothesis, and it was nurtured into shape by a small constellation of primatologists, among them researchers who had spent long years watching chimpanzees in sanctuaries and human infants in nurseries, watching them with the same careful patience, comparing what one species did with its eyes to what the other species did with its eyes, and noticing over time a difference so profound that it asked to be explained, a difference that whispered of something fundamental in what it means to be human, something that begins not with grand monuments or sweeping migrations, but with the simple quiet act of one creature looking at another and being seen looking. To understand the hypothesis is to step softly into a research room, a quiet space with neutral walls and soft lighting, where a chair has been placed and a small table set before it, and where a chimpanzee, friendly and curious, sits comfortably across from a human who will become, for these long minutes, something like a living puzzle. The human, calm and unhurried, performs a careful sequence of small movements, sometimes turning the entire head toward a point in the room, sometimes keeping the head still and shifting only the eyes, sometimes closing the eyes entirely while turning the head, sometimes keeping the eyes open while leaving the head perfectly still. And in each of these small variations, the question is the same, the question of which signal the chimpanzee will follow, which cue will catch the chimpanzee's attention and pull it toward the same target. And the chimpanzee, in study after study, in trial after gentle trial, follows the head. The chimpanzee watches the great rotation of the skull, the swing of the jaw, the broad turning of the shoulders that the head rotation implies, and the chimpanzee tracks all of this and looks where the head has pointed. But when only the eyes move, when the human keeps the head perfectly still and merely flicks the gaze towards something in the corner of the room, the chimpanzee does not follow, does not catch the cue, does not register that the eyes have done anything at all worth attending to, and the same pattern emerges more or less with gorillas and bonobos and orangutans, with all the great cousins of the human family, each of them readers of bodies, each of them watchers of postures, none of them quite tuned to the small dancing flicker of the eye alone. And then, in the same kind of quiet room, in the same kind of careful study, a human infant takes the seat instead, an infant so young she cannot yet form a sentence, an infant whose vocabulary, if she has one at all, consists of a few delighted syllables and the bright wordless music of her own laughter, and the experimenter performs the same gentle sequence, sometimes turning the head, sometimes moving only the eyes, and the infant, this small and silent creature who's not yet learned the names of the things in her world, follows the eyes. She follows the eyes when the head is still. She follows the eyes when the eyes go one way and the head goes another. She tracks gaze like a creature born to track gaze, like a small navigator whose compass is not the magnetic pole but the dark moving pupil of another being's attention. And she does this not because anyone has taught her, not because she's memorized a rule, but because something in her, something written deep in the inheritance of her species, knows that the eyes of others are signals worth reading. This is the discovery at the heart of the hypothesis, and like many of the most important discoveries, it is the kind of finding that seems obvious only after it has been pointed out. Of course the human infant follows the eyes. Of course the chimpanzee follows the head. But why should it be so? Why should the small tilt of an iris matter so much to the one and so little to the other? And the answer, soft and astonishing, lies in the very anatomy that has just been described, in the bright pale sclera that surrounds the human iris like a frame of clean parchment, a frame that catches the light and shows the position of the eye, that broadcasts gaze direction as clearly as a small flag waving in a window. Without that bright frame, the eyes are dark within darkness, and even the most attentive watcher cannot tell which way they point. But with the bright frame, the direction of attention becomes visible from across a clearing, across a fire, across the length of a long, quiet room. And once that visibility exists, once the eyes of every human in a group are readable by every other human in the group, something extraordinary becomes possible, something that has shaped every human society from the smallest band of foragers to the largest sprawling city, something that runs as silently and constantly through human life as the breath itself, and that something is the sharing of attention. When one human looks at a thing, every other human nearby can know what that human is looking at, and from this single small fact, from this almost trivial seeming detail, an entire architecture of cooperation rises like a great patient cathedral built in air. Consider what it means for a hunter standing at the edge of a thicket to spot the small movement of an animal in the brush. The hunter does not need to call out. The hunter does not need to gesture wildly with the arms. The hunter only needs to look, and any companion who has been quietly watching the hunter's face will see the eyes shift, will follow the line of that gaze, will find the same animal in the same brush, and the two of them will know, without a word, what is to be done. Consider what it means for a mother holding a child near the lip of a deep stream to see, suddenly a snake winding through the grass beyond the child's small foot. The mother need not shout, need not startle the child into movement. She can simply look, hard and steady at the danger, and any other adult nearby will see her looking and follow her gaze and understand. Consider what it means for one person to point at the moon. The pointing finger is a beautiful gesture, but it is only half a gesture, for the watcher who follows the finger must also be able to follow the eyes, must read the gaze that runs along the line of the arm, must be able to confirm by the orientation of the pointer's pupils that yes, the moon is what is meant, the moon and not the cloud beside it, the moon and not the rooftop beneath it, the moon and not some other gleam in the night sky. A pointed finger, in other words, is a sentence with two halves. The finger is the first half, the eyes are the second. And without the bright readable eyes, the sentence falls apart, becomes ambiguous, becomes a riddle. With the bright readable eyes, the sentence completes itself instantly, silently, with the elegance of two notes resolving into a chord. The other primates have eloquence of their own, a rich and ancient eloquence that should never be underestimated. They speak with their bodies in ways the human eye sometimes struggles to decipher. They share food, they groom one another, they form alliances and solve quarrels and care for orphans and play long elaborate games. They have culture, they have memory, they have something very much like friendship. But what they lack, what their dark sclera quietly forecloses, is the simple gift of sharing attention at a glance. To direct another chimpanzee's gaze, a chimpanzee must usually move the whole body, lift a hand, turn the trunk, lean toward what is meant, walk in the direction of interest. The communication is possible, but it is loud, it is broad, it is expensive in motion and time. It cannot be done from across a clearing without alerting every other creature for 100 meters around. It cannot be done in stillness. It cannot be done in silence. And so the cooperation it permits is real, but bounded, capable but constrained. A cooperation built with heavy tools, rather than with the fine, bright instrument of the visible eye. There is a larger framework into which this small visual fact has been gently woven, a framework called shared intentionality. The idea that humans are perhaps the only species on the planet with the capacity to hold a common goal in two minds at once, a goal that exists nowhere in the physical world but only in the shared imagination of two thinkers, a goal toward which both can bend their effort even though neither has spoken the goal aloud. Two humans can look at a tree and silently agree by the smallest exchange of glances to lift it together. Two humans can look at a future, an unbuilt house, an unfinished plan, a meal not yet cooked, a journey not yet taken, and reach a wordless accord about who will do what and when. The thing they coordinate around does not exist. It lives only in the air between them, and yet they coordinate fluidly, instantly, like dancers who have never met but somehow know the same dance. And the medium through which this coordination flows, the channel through which the shared intention passes from mind to mind, is so often the eyes, the bright readable eyes, the eyes that can hold a thought aloft and pass it across a room without ever opening the mouth. To feel the weight of this gift, imagine a savanna long ago in some unrecorded morning, the grass tall and silver, the wind small and steady, the air carrying the warm grass smell of a herd of grazing animals beyond a low rise. 4 hunters move quietly through the grass. They have walked together since dawn, since long before dawn, and they have not needed many words. They are spreading out now, each finding a careful angle on the herd, each lowering into a posture of waiting. The lead hunter, near the front of the small fan of bodies, sees what the others have not yet seen. A young gazelle slightly separated from the rest, its mother distracted by another nibble of leaves, its small body drifting toward the open edge of the herd where the wind will carry no warning back to the others. The lead hunter does not speak. The lead hunter does not raise an arm. The lead hunter simply lets the eyes rest with quiet pressure on the young gazelle, lets the gaze hold there for one long moment, then lets it shift slowly, deliberately, to one of the other hunters, and back again to the gazelle, and then to a second hunter, and then back to the gazelle. The other hunters see this. They see the bright whites of the lead hunter's eyes shift like small bright sails turning into the wind. They follow that gaze and find the gazelle. They understand in the same heartbeat the geometry of the situation. Who must move first? Who must hold position? Who must drift slightly to the right to close off the only path of escape? The plan forms in the air between them like a frost crystal forming on a window, intricate and complete, drawn in nothing but glances. They move. The hunt unfolds. And when it is over, when the gazelle has fallen and the others of the herd have run, the four hunters meet again in the trampled grass, exchanging only a few small soft glances of acknowledgement, of quiet pride, of plans for the carrying home, and again the eyes are the language. This is what the cooperative eye hypothesis proposes. This is what the bright white sclera is for. The dark-eyed predators of the savannah can hunt cooperatively too, of course. The lions in their prides and the wolves in their packs and the wild dogs in their loose dappled bands, and they do astonishing things together, sweeping across plains in coordinated arcs, splitting prey from herds with the precision of choreographed dancers, but the means by which they coordinate are different, older, slower in a sense, though no less effective. They lean on smell, on the scent trails left in trampled grass and the sharp musk of fear. They lean on sound, on the small grunts and chuffs and low panting calls that pass through the air. They lean on long-learned routines, on patterns of hunting, practiced from cubhood, on roles that have hardened over generations of living together in a single pack. What they do not have is the moment-to-moment readability of one another's eyes, the ability to glance and know, the ability to redirect a partner's attention in a single silent flick of the gaze. Their hunts, magnificent as they are, run on different rails than the human hunt runs upon, and the difference, again, sits in the small bright window of the visible eye. Step now from the savannah into a smaller and more tender scene, a scene that is, in many ways, where the gift first does its work. Picture a mother and a newborn, the mother resting back against something soft, the newborn cradled in the curve of her arm, the small body warm and breathing and turning slightly toward the warmth of her chest. The mother gazes at the infant's face. She does this for hours across the long days of those first weeks, for hours upon hours, for so much of her waking time that the gaze becomes the very texture of her motherhood, and the infant from a startlingly early age gazes back. The infant cannot focus on far things yet, but the face of the mother at this nursing distance is the perfect distance for the infant's developing eye, and so the infant looks, and the infant sees, and within a few short weeks the infant has begun to do something that no other primate infant does so readily. The infant has begun to notice where the mother's eyes are pointing. The mother glances at a small bright object near the cradle, and the infant's eyes, slowly, hesitantly, follow. The mother looks toward a window where a leaf is moving in the breeze, and the infant's eyes drift in the same direction. By the time the child can sit up, by the time the small back has firmed enough to hold the head erect for long minutes, the child is reading gaze with the easy confidence of a creature that has done this since the beginning of itself, and by the time the child can crawl, can pull along the floor toward whatever has caught its small attention, the child can also follow a finger pointed across the room, can find the object the parent has indicated, even when that object is 20 feet away, can do this so reliably that adults rarely notice how miraculous it is, how strange it would seem to an alien observer that a creature so small and so wordless can already understand the geometry of pointing, the line that runs from the fingertip through the air to the thing meant. The child, during all of this, is doing something even more profound than tracking objects. The child is learning the world by watching what the mother is watching. The child sees that the mother's gaze rests warmly on a particular kind of fruit, and learns that this fruit is worthy of attention. The child sees that the mother's gaze sharpens, hardens, narrows when something dangerous moves in the periphery, and learns, even before any words are spoken, that the dangerous thing is dangerous. The child sees the mother smile at certain faces and frown at others, and from these small lessons, written entirely in the language of the eyes, the child begins to assemble a map of the social world, a map of who is kin and who is stranger, who is safe and who is wary, what is to be eaten and what is to be avoided. The mother is teaching the child constantly without ever needing to teach. The eyes do all of it. The bright readable eyes carry whole curricula across the small distance between two faces, and it is not only the mother. Consider for a moment a small cave or a small hut, or the soft shadow beneath an old wide tree somewhere far back in time, where a grandmother, her hair silver and her hands marked with the soft brown spots of long sun, sits with a granddaughter at her knee. Between them on the ground lies a small heap of berries gathered that morning, a scatter of red and dark and pale blue jewels still beaded with dew, and among them, easy to miss, a few that look almost like the safe ones but are not, a few that carry quiet poison beneath their bright skins. The grandmother does not need to lecture. The grandmother does not need to lay down rules in long, careful sentences. The grandmother simply looks. She looks at one of the safe berries, soft and steady, and the child, leaning toward her, sees that gaze and follows it, and looks at the same berry, and the grandmother nods almost imperceptibly, and the child reaches for the berry and picks it up, and the grandmother's gaze flicks to the next safe berry, and the child's gaze follows again, and then the grandmother's gaze rests, just for a moment, with a small tightening of the brow, on one of the false berries, and the child sees the difference in that gaze, the slight cooling of attention, the small hint of warning, and the child does not pick it up. This is teaching at the speed of light, teaching that bypasses words entirely, teaching that flows through the bright air in tiny shifts of pupil and small movements of brow and the soft architecture of the face, and it can be done because the child can see instantly where the grandmother is looking. It can be done because the white sclera frames the dark iris and turns each small motion of attention into a beacon. Across thousands and thousands of years, this kind of teaching, this gentle silent transmission of knowledge through the channel of shared gaze, has been one of the great quiet engines of human survival. The way one generation hands its hard-won knowledge of plants and animals and weather and danger to the next generation, without ever needing a school or a textbook or a single spoken word. And now consider slowly what the human story would look like without this gift. Consider a version of humanity in which the eyes were as dark and unreadable as the eyes of every other great ape, in which the iris filled the visible window and no bright frame surrounded it, in which every glance was a closed letter that no one else could read. Joint hunting would still be possible, but it would be clumsy, slow, dependent on broad gestures and audible signals that would scatter the prey before the spear could fly. Mass migration in groups would still be possible, but it would be more chaotic, more vulnerable, less able to coordinate around the silent recognition of distant landmarks. Building a shelter together would still be possible, but the small constant adjustments of shared attention that make group construction feel so easy, the way one builder looks at a beam and another follows the look and steps in to help lift it, would be muffled, slowed, replaced by the heavier choreography of speech and gesture. Almost everything that humans do together, almost every thread of the long woven cloth of cooperation that distinguishes the species, would be possible only in a thinner and more strained form. The bright white eye in this telling is not a flourish, not an accident, not a vanity of evolution. It is the unsung infrastructure beneath the temple of human cooperation, the quiet beam of wood that holds up the whole roof. And there is a beautiful piece of evidence for all of this that comes not from chimpanzees or from human infants, but from a much closer and warmer companion, the dog who lies at the human foot. Dogs, modern domestic dogs, are surprisingly good at reading human gaze, far better than their wild ancestors, the wolves, who descend of course from the same deep root. A wolf raised by humans can be intelligent, attentive, deeply bonded, and yet a wolf does not, on the whole, look up at a human face and read the direction of human eyes the way a dog does. A dog, even a young dog with only weeks of life behind it, will follow a human's gaze toward a hidden bit of food, will check a human's face for guidance when a strange object enters the room, will track the small motions of the human eye with a careful, private attentiveness that is, in the language of biologists, downright eerie. Why? Because for tens of thousands of years, dogs have lived alongside humans in a slow, patient partnership, sharing fires, sharing hearths, sharing meals and shelters and journeys and dangers, and across all those long generations, the dogs that were better at reading human cues, that could glance at a human face and understand what the human was looking at, that could follow a human gaze toward a coming threat or a coming meal, were the dogs that were kept, that were fed, that were allowed to sleep near the warmth, that left more puppies behind, while the dogs that could not read humans drifted slowly out of the lineage. The wolves did not undergo this filter. The wolves remained wild and read other wolves brilliantly by every cue except the human one. The dogs evolved into the human gaze system. The dogs reshaped themselves to fit the bright, readable eye, and the very fact that dogs could do this, the very fact that an entirely separate species could specialize itself across millennia for the reading of human eyes, is a quiet testament to how powerful and how usable that signal must be. The whites are why. The whites made dogs possible in a sense, just as the whites made teachers possible, and hunters possible, and mothers reading their infants possible, and grandmothers handing down whole forests of berry knowledge in a single afternoon possible. And so the cooperative eye hypothesis settles into the long, quiet conversation about the human face like a pebble, settling into the still bottom of a pond, sending out small ripples that touch nearly every shore of human life, the ripples reaching the hunting band on the savannah, the mother in her cradle hour, the grandmother under her old tree, the dog asleep on the rug beside the door, the workers raising a roof together without speaking, the friends meeting eyes across a crowded room and knowing, without a word, that they are thinking the same small thought, the bright frame of pale tissue around the iris, that small unassuming detail of human anatomy, becomes in this telling something close to sacred, the channel through which two minds can become, briefly, one mind, the silent road by which a whole species learn to walk together toward goals that none of them could see, except in the shared dim light of imagination. Yet for all the beauty of this hypothesis, for all the ways it seems to fit the shape of the human story, there are other voices in the gentle conversation of evolution, other thinkers who look at the same bright white window and wonder whether perhaps cooperation is only part of the answer, whether there might be something else at work in the shaping of that pale frame, something more intimate and more selective, something that has less to do with the silent choreography of the hunt and more to do with the quiet glances exchanged between two faces drawn toward one another in the long firelit evenings of our ancient past. Glances that searched each other not for shared attention, but for something deeper still, something written in the very clarity of the white itself, a small bright letter of vitality and youth and well-being waiting to be read. And yet, even as the cooperative eye hypothesis lays down its quiet, persuasive blanket of explanation across the long valley of human evolution, there remains a second current running beneath it, a softer pressure, slower and more intimate, which many scientists believe worked alongside the first to fix the trait of the white sclera so completely in our species that no human anywhere is born without it. This second pressure has nothing to do with hunting parties, or shared glances across firelit clearings, or the careful coordination of group labour, and everything to do with the most ancient and quietest force in all of biology, the long patient sieve of who chooses whom, generation after generation, and what those choices, repeated countless times across countless thousands of years, slowly carve into the body of a species. The idea is sometimes called the mate selection hypothesis, and though it sounds at first like a competing theory, a rival explanation, most researchers now describe it not as a contradiction, but as a companion, the second hand of the same gentle clock, working in tandem with cooperation to lift the white of the human eye into the strange and luminous prominence we see today. The reasoning begins with a concept that runs deep through evolutionary biology, the concept of the honest signal, a trait that, by its very nature, cannot be faked. In the wide animal kingdom there are countless signals that creatures display to one another, signals of strength, of fertility, of fitness, but many of these signals can be bluffed, exaggerated, costumed over a weaker body. A bird may puff its feathers to seem larger, a frog may inflate its throat to seem louder, but certain traits, certain quiet displays of the body, can only be produced by a body that is genuinely well, genuinely thriving, genuinely capable of allocating its precious resources to something extra, something costly, something beautiful. The peacock's tail is the textbook example, that great ridiculous burden of iridescent feathers which serves no purpose for flight or warmth or feeding, and which can only be grown and maintained by a male whose body has the surplus health to spend on it. A sickly peacock cannot produce a glorious tail. A starving peacock cannot keep one shining. The tail therefore tells the truth about the bird beneath it, and that is why peahens have been studying tails for millions of years. The bright, clear, polished white of a healthy human eye, some scientists suggest, may be doing exactly the same work, in a quieter and far less ostentatious key. The sclera, that thin layer of dense connective tissue wrapping around the eyeball, is not white because it must be. It is white because the structure beneath has remained free of stains, free of pigment, free of the small dramas of disease and depletion that would otherwise tint it some other shade. And because it is so visible, so close to the surface, so brightly framed by the dark iris and dark pupil at the centre, the sclera serves as a kind of small, quiet, unblinking billboard upon which the body cannot help but advertise its inner state. You cannot fake clear whites. You cannot rouge them or paint them or train them to lie. They reflect blood chemistry, hydration, the rhythm and depth of last night's sleep, the levels of hormones flowing through the bloodstream, the patient labour of the liver as it filters out the body's many waste products. They reflect, in short, the entire silent functioning of the inner self, and they reflect it in real time, glowing softly back at anyone who looks. Consider, for a moment, what happens when those whites turn yellow. In the language of medicine, the condition is called jaundice, and it occurs when a substance called bilirubin, normally processed and removed by a healthy liver, accumulates in the bloodstream and begins to seep into the tissues, including the sclera. The whites of the eyes, being thin and translucent, show this pigment first, before the skin, before the fingertips, before any other sign. A person whose eyes are yellowing is a person whose liver is struggling, perhaps from infection, perhaps from a build-up of toxins, perhaps from some inherited frailty, and in the prehistoric world, when there were no doctors and no hospitals and no bright fluorescent rooms with diagnostic tools, anyone who looked into the face of such a person would have seen, with quiet certainty, that this was someone whose body was not winning the slow contest of survival. The yellowing eye was a forecast. It told a story not of who a person had been, but of who they likely would not become. And although the prehistoric mind would not have known the word liver, would not have known the word bilirubin, would not have known the word jaundice, it would have known, through the long inherited wisdom of pattern recognition, that these were eyes that did not promise a long road ahead. Or consider what happens when those same whites turn red. The thin tissue of the sclera is laced with tiny blood vessels, ordinarily so faint as to be invisible, threading through the membrane like the smallest streams running beneath a winter ice. When the body is healthy and rested, these vessels are quiet, narrow, recessive. But when something goes wrong, when a person has been coughing for weeks from some lung infection, when fatigue has gathered in the bones, when chronic stress has tightened every tendon and shortened every breath, when sleep has been thin or absent for many nights in a row, those tiny vessels swell and fill, and what was once a smooth pale field becomes a webbed and bloodshot landscape, branching and pink and tired-looking. Bloodshot eyes. The modern phrase carries the same weight that prehistoric perception would have carried, the wordless reading of a body that is not at peace, a body engaged in some inner battle, a body whose reserves are being spent on something other than the simple maintenance of brightness. To look at someone with deeply red whites was to look at someone whose system was straining, and to know, without quite knowing how one knew, that this was a moment of weakness rather than strength. And consider too the third condition, the grey and the dull and the muddy, the whites that have lost their pearly luminance and taken on a flat ashen tone. These are the eyes of a body running long on too little, the eyes of chronic dehydration, the eyes of malnutrition, the eyes of parasitic burden, the eyes of someone whose years have not contained enough food, enough water, enough rest, enough of the small daily nourishments that keep the tissues plump and bright. A child raised in lean times might carry these dull eyes into adulthood, the sclera never quite recovering its full brilliance. An adult worn down by famine or sickness might watch their own whites fade slowly across a single hard winter. To others, the dullness would have read as a quiet shadow, a sign that this person had not been thriving, that the years behind them had been thin, that the body before them was not the kind of body that promised abundance for whatever came next. Now, place these three small, silent signals into the context of a world in which choosing a partner was, in the most literal sense, choosing the future. In prehistoric times, before the strange modern luxury of separating love from biology, before contraception, before pediatricians and antibiotics, before any of the soft cushions of civilization, a partnership was the single most consequential decision a person could make for the lives of any children that might follow. The genes one chose to pair with one's own would either help those children thrive or hinder them. The body one paired with would either be a strong and steady partner across the years of raising those children, or a fragile one likely to fall away into illness or early death, leaving the family undefended. And in a world without medical knowledge, without blood tests, without any clinical method of evaluating another person's hidden condition, the eyes were one of the few reliable readouts of the body's deeper truth, glowing or dimmed according to the actual state of the inner self. A clear, bright, gleaming white eye in such a world was something close to a moving advertisement, gentle and unintentional but unmistakable, a quiet broadcast that this person's body was working, that the liver was healthy, that the blood was clean, that the long chain of cellular maintenance was holding firm, that whatever children might inherit this body's instructions would inherit instructions that had been written in a healthy hand. It was not a calculation that anyone made consciously. No prehistoric person stood beside a stream evaluating the bilirubin levels of a potential mate. The judgment happened far below thought, in the same wordless place where birds notice plumage and deer notice antlers, the slow tribunal of perception that runs beneath awareness and shapes the long course of who pairs with whom, and yet the result, played out across countless generations, would have been the same as if someone had been counting and weighing all along. The brighter the whites, the more often the body was chosen. The more often the body was chosen, the more often its genes travelled forward into the next generation. The more often those genes travelled forward, the more deeply the trait was carried into the species itself, until clear whites became not simply a sign of health, but a built-in expectation, a basic feature of what a human face was supposed to look like. The evidence for this, scattered as it is, can be found laid across the cultural traditions of the world. Almost every human society, regardless of where it grew up or what climate shaped it or what language it spoke, has woven the eyes into its language of beauty and life. Across continents, across millennia, across the long catalogue of human storytelling, the eyes are described again and again with metaphors of light, of brightness, of clarity, of stars, of dew, of polished stone, of moonlight on water. Folk songs in many languages praise the bright eyes of the beloved. Poems written thousands of years apart in cultures that never met return to the same imagery of luminous gaze. Healthy eyes are called shining, sparkling, glowing, clear, fresh, alive. Sick eyes are called dull, sunken, clouded, dim. The vocabulary repeats itself with a quiet stubbornness across languages whose words otherwise share nothing in common. And that kind of convergence, that pattern of cultures arriving independently at the same observation, suggests a perception that lies deeper than culture itself. A perception that runs in the ancient bones of the species rather than in any particular tradition. There is another layer to this signal, beyond simple health, and it has to do with age. The whites of the eyes are not only a register of how the body is faring at this moment, they are also a quiet diary of how many years the body has carried. Newborns have famously pure white sclera, almost translucent in their freshness, untouched by sun damage, untouched by the slow oxidative processes that gradually turn tissue more yellow over time, untouched by the many small weatherings of life. A baby's eyes seem to hold within them the entire stock of brightness a body will ever possess. As childhood unfolds, the whites remain remarkably clear, polished, still pearly. Through adolescence and into early adulthood, that brilliance persists, though it may shift in subtle ways. Then, as the years accumulate very gradually, the whites begin to take on a slightly warmer tone, the faintest yellowing of accumulated pigment, the first thin networks of capillary visible beneath the surface, the small dimming that comes from a body that has been working a long time. By later life, the whites have lost a measure of their original glow, like the surface of an old pearl that has been carried in many pockets across many years. In the prehistoric world, where survival to old age was rare, and where the rearing of children required many years of partnership, the eyes therefore signalled something in addition to current health. They signalled the rough span of years a body had behind it, and by extension, the rough span of years it might still have ahead. Mate choice pressure, working slowly and below conscious calculation, would have favoured partners whose eyes still held the brightness of relative youth. Partners whose remaining years promised the long stretch of co-parenting that human children require. Partners whose bodies had not yet begun the small dimming of late life. This was not cruelty, not vanity, not the shallow preoccupation that the modern world sometimes mistakes it for. It was the slow logic of a species whose offspring need many years of care, written into perception so quietly that no one ever needed to articulate it. And here the theory finds its most elegant motion, the motion of the feedback loop. Once white eyes became a preferred trait, once the species began to carry a quiet preference for clear whites in its mating choices, the door was open for any random genetic variation that pushed the trait further to be favoured even more strongly. A child born with whites slightly whiter than the local average, slightly more vivid, slightly more bright, would have, on average, a small statistical advantage in eventually finding partners. That child's children would inherit those slightly whiter whites and would carry the same small advantage forward. Across thousands of generations, those small advantages compounded, the way the small advantages of natural selection always do, slowly amplifying the trait until the human eye reached the extreme expression we see today, an expression so unique that no other primate on the planet shares it. The species painted itself with its own preferences, slowly over the deep span of evolutionary time, until the whites of human eyes became the brightest, clearest whites in the entire animal kingdom. Not every scientist is convinced, however, that mate selection alone could have done this work. There are those who point out fairly that mate selection cannot easily explain why the trait would be specifically white rather than simply bright, why depigmentation rather than some other dramatic alteration of the eye. The cooperative eye hypothesis answers that question more directly, suggesting that white was selected because white maximizes contrast with the dark iris, and therefore maximizes the readability of gaze direction. Mate selection, on its own, might have produced any number of striking eye traits, ringed irises or spotted sclera or some other ornament. But instead the species converged on this particular form, this maximally legible form, and that legibility itself points back toward the cooperative function of the trait. So the mate selection hypothesis, while it explains beautifully why the trait would be fixed so universally and so deeply, does not by itself explain why the trait took the specific shape it took. This is why most modern researchers, weighing the evidence carefully, have arrived at a synthesis rather than a competition. The two hypotheses, they suggest, were probably never rivals at all but partners, working at different layers of the same long process. Cooperative eye communication, they argue, was likely the original force that opened the door, the original pressure that selected for visible sclera in early hominins because visible sclera made shared attention possible, made coordinated hunting possible, made teaching and learning possible, made the whole intricate machinery of social cognition possible. That force established the basic trait, the white eye, the readable gaze, and then, once the trait was in place, mate selection took it up as a second instrument, intensifying and refining it, fixing it across all populations of the species, ensuring that no human anywhere could be born without it, ensuring that the brightness of the trait would be amplified and maintained at the very edge of what biology can produce. The cooperative pressure built the instrument, the selection pressure tuned it, and together, working across hundreds of thousands of years, they shaped a trait that is at once functional and beautiful, useful and luminous, practical and profoundly seen. There is something strange and quietly remarkable about the consequence of all this, when one pauses to consider it. Humans are perhaps the only species in the world for whom beauty includes a trait that cannot be hidden. Other creatures have many ways of disguising their health from one another: thick fur that conceals bone structure, elaborate displays that can be performed only when the body is willing, behavioral signals that can be turned on and off. A wolf can hide a limp for a few minutes if it must. A bird can sing despite a cold. A cat can carry itself with feigned vigour across a difficult morning. But a human cannot disguise the whites of their eyes. They are exposed to every passing glance, every moment of every day, in every conversation and every quiet encounter. They broadcast the body's condition to anyone who looks, with no curtain and no veil, and no chance to compose oneself before the message goes out. This means that in every human interaction, across every culture, in every generation, a small silent exchange of biological information has been taking place beneath the spoken words, a quiet reading of brightness and clarity, of redness and dullness, of the small honest signals the body cannot stop sending. A young woman beside a prehistoric fire, her eyes catching the orange light of the flames, sending out a quiet signal of strength and youth, without ever having spoken a word, and a young man across that same fire receiving that signal in some pre-verbal place beneath thought, the fire moving across both pairs of eyes in a recognition that has no language. A modern person standing before a bathroom mirror after a difficult week, peering at the slight redness in their whites, the slight dimming, reading their own body's report and feeling, perhaps, the wordless concern that has run in human nervous systems for so many millennia. A doctor in a hospital corridor leaning gently to examine the yellowing in a patient's sclera, performing in the bright light of a clinical lamp the same quiet diagnostic act that a prehistoric mother might have performed beside a stream, reading the liver through the eye, reading the body through its smallest window. A pair of hominins meeting in the dappled shade of an ancient forest, separated by some clearing of fern and stone, looking across the green air at each other and seeing, in the brightness of the other's gaze, a glimmer of mutual recognition, a glimmer of biological message and cooperative possibility, the white sclera doing its quiet double work, signalling at once the readiness for shared attention and the silent assurance of inner health. The trait that allowed them to look together at the same distant tree was the same trait that allowed them to look at each other and know, in some unsayable way, that here was a body worth pairing with, here was a future worth building together. And the long, slow accumulation of such moments, across all the green forests and golden savannas and chilly caves of the long human story, has woven itself into who we are at the deepest level, written into our faces, written into our preferences, written into our perception of beauty and trust and recognition. So the white of the human eye, sitting there so unobtrusively in every face we will ever see, carries within it not one quiet evolutionary story, but two, threaded together so closely that they cannot really be untangled. The story of cooperation and the story of choice, the story of what we needed to do together, and the story of what we needed to find in one another. And as this trait took root and amplified across the long, slow generations, it began to do something more than signal health and direct attention. It began, in ways the species itself could not have foreseen, to shape the whole architecture of human society, to lay the silent foundation upon which language and ritual and storytelling would eventually rise, the small white window through which so much of what makes us human would come to pour. And so the small bright window of the white sclera, having first emerged as a tool for shared attention, and then having been polished further by the long slow workings of mate selection, did not stop there in its quiet shaping of the human story. The trait, once fixed in the species, became something far larger than the sum of the pressures that had originally produced it. It became, in a way that no one could have predicted, the foundation upon which an entire new kind of social world was built, a foundation upon which language and ritual and storytelling and teaching and cooperation at vast scale would all eventually rise, a small biological cornerstone bearing the weight of nearly everything we now think of as distinctively human. To feel the depth of this transformation, drift back once more to the savannah, but step now beyond the single hunting party, beyond the single mother and child, beyond the single grandmother teaching her granddaughter the names of berries. Step into the wider canvas of an entire small community of early humans, 20 or 30 individuals living together in a loose and shifting band, sharing fires, sharing shelter, sharing the long, careful labour of staying alive in a world full of teeth and claws and uncertain weather. Watch them through the long arc of an ordinary day, from the first grey light of dawn to the last orange ember of evening, and notice how often, how constantly, how quietly, the bright white eyes of every member of the community are doing their slow, patient work in the air between bodies. In the morning, when the band first stirs from sleep, glances pass between adults who are still half awake. Glances that ask without words whether last night was peaceful, whether the children are well, whether anyone fell ill in the dark hours, whether the fire still has its small heart of glowing coals. Those glances are received and answered with other glances, small confirmations, small quiet acknowledgements that the night has been survived and that the day can begin. No one has spoken yet. The first words of the morning will not come for some time, and yet a great deal of information has already passed between every pair of eyes in the camp, information about mood and health and readiness, information that will shape who walks together to gather water, who stays behind to tend the fire, who takes the children for the morning's small explorations of the surrounding grass. By mid-morning, when small groups have spread out across the nearby landscape, the eyes are still doing their work, even at distances that would seem to make them useless. Two women foraging for tubers along a sandy slope can glance at each other across 30 metres of open ground, and exchange whole sentences in a single look, a question about whether enough roots have been gathered, an observation about the changing light, a small private warmth that has nothing to do with the work and everything to do with the long friendship between them. A man at the edge of a copse of trees can catch the eye of a younger companion across the clearing and convey, with a single steady look, that something has been heard in the brush, that everyone should still themselves and listen, that the small unfamiliar sound might be worth investigating. The information travels invisibly, soundlessly, on the bright pale rails of the visible sclera, and the band coordinates itself across distances that would have required loud and dangerous calling in any other species. When the small hunting party returns at midday with whatever it has caught, the eyes are again the medium of celebration and disappointment, of welcome and reproach. A lead hunter who has lost a kill at the last moment will not need to confess the loss in words. The downcast tilt of the eyes, the way the gaze refuses to meet the gaze of the elder waiting at the fire, will tell the whole story. An elder who is pleased with the day's work will not need to praise the hunters with the elaborate speeches. The warm, steady look that meets the returning party as they walk into camp will say more than any phrase could. Pride, disappointment, gratitude, encouragement, all of these complex social emotions, the very emotions that hold any human community together across the rough surface of daily life, can travel from one heart to another along the bright thin thread of the shared white eye. And in the long, slow afternoons, when the heat has driven everyone into the shade of the larger trees, when the hunting and the foraging are done, and the band has come together to rest and to mend tools and to nurse infants and to play with small children, the eyes do another kind of work, the work of binding the community itself, of weaving the small glances of moment-to-moment recognition that knit 30 individuals into something more than the sum of 30 bodies. A grandmother smiles at a granddaughter, and the granddaughter, looking back, learns again, for the 1000th time, that she is loved. A young man catches the eye of a young woman across a small distance, and a quiet, unspoken understanding passes between them, an understanding that they are aware of each other, that something in the air between them might one day grow into a partnership. Two old friends who have hunted together for 30 years exchange a look that needs no translation, a look that says nothing in particular and everything in general, the kind of look that only two long companions can share. Each of these small glances is a stitch in the cloth of community, and together, across the days and weeks and months and years, the stitches accumulate into a fabric that holds the band together against the constant pressures of the outside world. This kind of community life, this dense ongoing web of shared gaze, is something that no other species, even the most social, has quite managed to weave in the same way. Wolf packs are tightly bonded, elephant herds are profoundly social, dolphins maintain elaborate friendships and alliances across long stretches of ocean, but the moment-to-moment sharing of attention, the small, constant, flickering exchange of micro-glances that runs through a human community, the way that 20 pairs of eyes can be aware in any given second of where many of the other eyes are looking and what those other minds are attending to, this is something that requires the bright, readable sclera of the human face. It is something that other species with their dark eyes simply cannot do at the same density, at the same speed, at the same sustained level, and it is something that, once available, opens the door to capabilities that would have been almost unimaginable in any earlier kind of social animal. The first and perhaps most important of these capabilities is what scientists have come to call the theory of mind. The ability of one creature to imagine, with some accuracy, what is going on in the inner experience of another creature. To have a theory of mind is to know that the person across from you sees the world from a slightly different angle than you do, that they have memories you do not have, that they want things you may not want, that their attention may be on a thing different from the thing your attention is on. It is to model another mind from inside your own mind, to run a small dim simulation of someone else's experience in the quiet workshop of your own thinking. And this capacity, which seems so basic to humans that we rarely notice it, is in fact astonishingly rare in the animal kingdom, present in only a handful of species, and present in humans to a degree that no other species comes close to matching. The bright readable eye is one of the great engines of the theory of mind. When you can see where another person is looking, you have an immediate window into where their attention is, and from where their attention is, you can begin to infer what they are thinking about, what they are interested in, what they may be planning, what they may be fearing or hoping or wondering about. The eye, in other words, is the visible tip of the inner mind, the small bright clue that allows you to triangulate the much larger invisible territory of the other person's experience. Without the bright eye, that triangulation becomes far harder, far slower, far more dependent on speech and gesture. With the bright eye, it happens automatically, all the time, with everyone you encounter, in every conversation and every shared task and every quiet moment of mutual presence. Once the theory of mind is in place, once humans have evolved the visible eye that makes it so much easier to model other minds, an entire architecture of social behavior becomes possible that would have been unreachable in any earlier kind of creature. Teaching becomes possible because the teacher can model what the student does and does not yet understand and adjust accordingly. Learning becomes radically faster because the student can model what the teacher knows and seek to align with it. Cooperation at scale becomes possible because each cooperating individual can hold in mind a model of what the other cooperators are intending, can adjust their own behavior to fit, can step in to fill gaps and step back to give space. Negotiation becomes possible because each party can model what the other party wants and craft offers accordingly. Storytelling becomes possible because the listener can model the inner experience of every character the storyteller describes. Even comedy becomes possible because the comedian can model the listener's expectations and then violate them in just the right way to produce laughter. All of this richness of social life, all of these small tender capacities that make human existence what it is, depend, in some deep underlying way, on the ability of one human to model the inner life of another, and that ability, in turn, depends in part on the bright visible eye that lets each of us see at a glance where the other is attending. The connections run deeper still. Many scholars now believe that language itself, that great and singular human invention, may have grown up alongside, and partly because of, the cooperative eye system. To utter a word that means something requires a speaker and a listener, and crucially, a shared object of attention. If a hunter wants to teach a younger companion the word for the small striped antelope grazing at the far edge of the herd, the hunter must be able to direct the younger companion's attention to that specific antelope and not to the larger antelope nearer at hand, not to the bird flying overhead, not to the cloud drifting on the horizon. The pointing finger helps, the spoken sound helps. But the whole pedagogical act depends on the younger companion being able to follow the older hunter's gaze to see exactly which antelope the older hunter is looking at, to align their own attention with the older hunter's attention so that the spoken sound can land on the right object. Without the bright readable sclera, this alignment is fuzzy, uncertain, often wrong. With it, the alignment is fast and accurate, and language can grow. And once language begins to grow, once words can be reliably attached to objects through the medium of shared gaze, the whole tower of human communication begins to rise. Names become possible, the names of people, of places, of plants and animals and tools and ideas. Stories become possible, with characters and settings and events that exist only in the shared imagination of teller and listener. Instructions become possible, with detailed sequences of actions that can be communicated across distance and time. Plans become possible, with futures sketched in air and agreed upon through carefully coordinated speech. Whole new kinds of knowledge become possible, knowledge that cannot be carried in any single mind but only in the shared mind of a community that talks and gazes together. And underneath all of it, holding it all up, sits the small unassuming foundation of the bright white eye, the visible sclera that made the original alignment of attention possible, the silent infrastructure beneath the entire palace of human communication. There is something almost dizzying about following these implications out to their full reach. Every spoken word in every language ever spoken by any human community, the entire vast inheritance of human verbal expression, owes a quiet debt to the small bright frame of pale tissue around every human iris. Every story ever told, every poem ever recited, every law ever debated, every prayer ever uttered, every lesson ever passed from one generation to the next, all of it grew up in a species whose members could share attention reliably and effortlessly, and that sharing was made possible in part by the visible sclera. Take the sclera away, dim it down to the dark continuous sphere of every other primate eye, and the whole tower trembles. Language grows more slowly. Teaching becomes harder. Cooperation breaks down at scale. The whole architecture of human society, which seems so solid and so inevitable, turns out to rest on a surprising fragility, a small, visible biological detail without which everything else might never have come together. And yet, of course, the trait did emerge, the architecture did rise, the species did become what it became, the bright eye did its slow, patient work, and we are the inheritors of that work, every one of us, in every face we ever see. Each time you look across a room and meet another person's eyes, each time you watch a friend's gaze drift towards something interesting and find your own gaze drifting along with it, each time you sit with a child and feel that small, still presence of attention being shared between you, you are taking part in a ritual that runs back through millions of years, a ritual made possible by the same trait that distinguishes our species from every other on Earth. The shared gaze is not merely an incidental feature of human life, it is one of the deepest things human life is made of, and the bright sclera of the human eye is the small silent organ through which it flows. Even in the digital age, even in a world where we increasingly communicate through screens rather than through faces, the underlying machinery of the shared gaze still shapes our experience in ways we rarely notice. When a video conversation feels strange, when a text message lacks something essential, when a long-distance friendship feels thinner than a face-to-face one, part of what is missing is the visible eye, the bright, readable sclera that would have carried so much information silently between two faces in the same room. Cameras and screens deliver some of the visual signal, but they cannot quite replicate the resolution and the immediacy of two people in the same physical space looking at the same thing, knowing they are looking at the same thing, sharing that attention, in the small, ancient way that the human face has always made possible. We feel the loss without quite being able to name it. The loss is the loss of the shared gaze, and the shared gaze is ultimately the gift of the bright white eye. So the small biological feature that this long evening began with, this tiny ring of pigment-free collagen wrapping around every human iris, turns out to be something far stranger and far larger than it first appears. It turns out to be the small visible foundation upon which much of what makes us human was built. It turns out to be the silent partner of language, the quiet ancestor of teaching, the underground spring from which the whole river of human cooperation flows. It turns out, in the deepest and most surprising sense, to be one of the most consequential traits that any species has ever evolved, and every single one of us carries it, painted on the front of our face, every day of our lives, broadcasting our attention to anyone who looks, weaving us silently into the invisible web of every community we have ever belonged to, making possible the soft, fluent humanity that we so often take for granted. The soft, fluent humanity that no other creature on Earth has ever quite achieved in the same way. And so, the long road has run its course. The question that began so quietly so many hours ago has unfolded into the full shape of its answer, and the small bright window of the human eye, that small unassuming feature of the face, has revealed itself to be one of the most consequential biological gifts our species has ever received. The bright sclera, framing every human iris, is not a decoration and not an accident. It is a tool, an instrument, a soft, visible signal that has been shaped across millions of years to do something very specific and very important, the work of allowing one human mind to know, almost instantly, where another human mind is attending. And from that single small capacity, more than any other trait in the human body, has flowed the great river of everything that makes our species what it is, the cooperation, the teaching, the language, the storytelling, the ritual, the long-woven cloth of community life that we so often take for granted. Tonight, somewhere in the world, two people are sitting close together in a softly lit room, looking into each other's eyes. They do not know that the bright whites surrounding their pupils are nearly 2 million years old in the slow accounting of evolution. They do not know that the same trait was once carried by a small group of early humans on a savanna in Africa, that it spread from that small group across every continent, that it is now carried by every member of their species and by no other species on Earth. They do not know any of this, and they do not need to know it. The trait does its work without any awareness on their part. They simply look, and they are seen looking, and a quiet recognition passes between them that no words could quite capture. This is what the white sclera was made for in the deepest sense. This is the gift it has been carrying for so long, waiting patiently to be given again, in moments just like these, in rooms just like these, in lives just like these. Tonight, somewhere in the world, a mother is rocking her newborn to sleep. her gaze resting on the small breathing face of her child. The infant, half asleep, half awake, is gazing back at her with the bright pure whites of brand new eyes. Neither of them knows that this exchange, this slow, drifting, mutual look, is one of the oldest and most foundational acts in the whole repertoire of human existence. Neither of them knows that the same exchange has been happening between mothers and infants for hundreds of thousands of years, in caves and tents and homes of every kind, on every continent and in every climate, throughout the long becoming of our species. Neither of them needs to know. The exchange is happening, and it is doing its silent essential work, and the child is being woven, gaze by gaze, into the fabric of the human community that will hold them for the rest of their life. Tonight, somewhere in the world, an old friend is meeting another old friend after many years apart. They will sit across from each other in some quiet place, perhaps at a small table, perhaps on a wooden bench, perhaps on the steps of a familiar building, and they will look into each other's eyes for a long moment before either of them speaks. In that moment, before any word, the bright readable whites of their eyes will carry across the small space between them everything that the years have brought, the joys and the losses, the surprises and the small steady continuities, the way each life has been shaped by everything that has happened to it. The eyes will say it without saying it. The friendship will be renewed without ceremony. And the conversation that follows, the spoken conversation that comes after the silent one, will simply pick up the thread that the eyes have already begun to weave. These small moments, multiplied across every hour of every day on a planet of 8 billion human faces, are the constant ongoing work of the bright white eye. The trait is doing its slow patient labour right now, in millions of rooms, in millions of conversations, in millions of small flickering exchanges of attention between people who have no idea that anything special is happening at all. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful thing about this entire long story. The trait is invisible because it is so universal. It does its work because no one notices it. It holds the species together precisely because everyone takes it for granted. The bright white sclera is the great unsung infrastructure of human social life, and like all good infrastructure, it works best when it works without being seen. So as the night now draws toward its end, as the breath grows slower and the room grows softer, and the body begins to remember how to surrender itself to sleep, take with you, if you wish, a small new awareness of the bright whites in your own eyes, that small mysterious feature that you have carried with you every moment of every day, that you have carried into every conversation and every shared task and every quiet moment of mutual presence with everyone you have ever loved. The whites have been there the whole time, doing their patient invisible work, weaving you into the long warm cloth of the human community, allowing your attention to be seen and your gaze to be followed, and your inner life to be quietly known by anyone who looked. They will keep doing this work tomorrow and the day after and every day for the rest of your life. And on the days when you find yourself sitting with someone you love, looking quietly into their eyes, perhaps you will feel for a moment the small ancient weight of all that has gone into making this small, ordinary act possible. Tonight, drift into rest with that gentle awareness if it pleases you, and let it go if it does not. Either way, the eyes will keep their slow watch, the whites will keep their patient glow, and the long human story, woven of countless small shared glances, will continue to write itself across the faces of those who are still awake. There are many other strange and beautiful traits in the long inheritance of our species, many other small forgotten gifts that quietly shape the way we move through the world, and many of them are waiting for slow nights just like this one, waiting to be unfolded, waiting to be told, waiting for the soft hour and the still room and the willing listener. They will keep waiting. There is no hurry. The story is older than memory, and it is patient, and it knows how to find you when the time is right. For now the candle is low, the night is deep, and the bright whites of every human eye on earth are doing their quiet work in rooms you will never see and in lives you will never know. Sleep gently. Let the question that began so quietly settle now into the soft library of things you have learned, and let the body sink into its long, slow rest. The whites of your own eyes, in whatever room you are sleeping in tonight, will close gently behind their eyelids, and the small bright instrument that has carried so much of human history will rest along with the rest of you until morning comes, and the eyes open again, and the slow ongoing work of being human resumes itself in the soft grey light of another day. Sleep well. The story will be here, waiting patiently, the next time the night is long and the listener is ready.